ESPN's disrespect, why Caitlin Clark deserves more respect. ESPN recently dropped a ranking of the greatest women's college basketball players of all time, and shockingly, Caitlin Clark wasn't even in the top 5. Yet, their video title and thumbnail prominently featured her name, clearly using her as clickbait. They know she's the biggest name in basketball right now, the ultimate needle mover, yet they conveniently excluded her from their list. This is yet another blatant act of disrespect toward Caitlin Clark, while ESPN continues to push its biased narratives. The hypocrisy is undeniable. How can you argue that a player isn't a top 5 all-time great simply because they haven't won a championship? Larry Bird is widely regarded as one of the greatest college players ever. Did he win a title? No. But that never stopped ESPN from honoring his legacy. Clark led Iowa to back-to-back national championship games, shattered records, and revolutionized the sport. Yet her lack of a championship is suddenly the only thing that matters. It's the same network that ranks male players as all-time greats regardless of whether they won a championship. But when it comes to Caitlin Clark, they conveniently shift the criteria. This blatant double standard is impossible to ignore. And just when you think ESPN couldn't be more disrespectful, they outright left her off their top 5 greatest women's college basketball players list. We're not falling for their hypocrisy, and in this video, we're breaking down exactly how they are actively diminishing Clark's legacy to push their own agenda. It's fascinating how ESPN acknowledges Clark's historic accomplishments, records that no one else has broken, yet still refuses to rank her among the all-time best. They are more than happy to capitalize on her name for views, but when it comes to giving her the respect she deserves, they suddenly change the criteria. This bait-and-switch tactic is clear. Put Clark's name in the title to draw in viewers, then dismiss her as if she's not even in the conversation. But this rule has never applied to other players. ESPN has long honored male and female players who never won a national championship. Take, for example, Pete Maravich, Oscar Robertson, and Larry Bird. None of them won a college title, yet their greatness was never questioned. But for Clark, suddenly, championships are the deciding factor. It's laughable when you logically analyze it. Who from ESPN's list could have taken Iowa, without any other future WNBA stars, to back-to-back national championship games? Clark did more with less, yet that's not enough. The reality is, Caitlin Clark didn't just dominate statistically, she changed the game. Her offensive skill set is unmatched, her playmaking ability elevated everyone around her, and she carried a program that historically was not a powerhouse to the brink of a national championship. ESPN ranked Breanna Stewart as the greatest women's college basketball player ever. No doubt Stewart was incredible, but she also played at UConn, surrounded by elite talent, future WNBA stars, and coached by a Hall of Famer. If Clark had been placed in that same system, does anyone really think she wouldn't have won multiple championships? Meanwhile, Stewart on a stacked UConn team was rewarded for winning championships, but Clark, who transformed Iowa into a contender almost single-handedly, gets penalized. The inconsistency is glaring. Clark doesn't just have records, she has impact. Before Caitlin Clark, women's college basketball wasn't drawing record-breaking viewership. Now, she has packed arenas, shattered TV ratings, and sent merchandise sales through the roof. Yet ESPN conveniently ignores this influence when ranking all-time greats. No other player on their list has had this level of impact on the game's popularity. And this bias isn't just in their rankings, it's in their coverage. When Angel Reese taunted Clark during the national championship, ESPN defended it as competitive fire. But when Clark shows emotion, suddenly it's unsportsmanlike. The bias is clear. They spend more time covering WNBA players who criticize Clark than actually celebrating her accomplishments. They push the idea that she's overrated, despite all statistical and financial evidence proving otherwise. Caitlin Clark's greatness isn't just about the numbers she's put up, it's about the undeniable impact she's had on women's basketball as a whole. Her offensive skill set is unparalleled, her court vision and passing ability are elite, and she's transformed Iowa from a solid program into a powerhouse that made consecutive national championship appearances. Yet ESPN's argument against her all-time greatness boils down to one thing. She didn't win a national championship. But let's really break that down. A national championship is a team achievement, not an individual one. If winning a title is the sole measure of greatness, then why do individual awards exist at all? Why have players like Larry Bird, Oscar Robertson, and Pete Maravich been honored as some of the greatest to ever play, despite never winning it all? Clark's Iowa team was nowhere near as stacked as the UConn, Tennessee, or South Carolina teams that dominated women's basketball for decades. While players like Breanna Stewart, Cheryl Miller, and Maya Moore played alongside multiple future WNBA stars, Clark had no such advantage. She wasn't joining a program that was already a dynasty. She built one from scratch. Imagine swapping Clark with Stewart. If Caitlin Clark had been at UConn under Gino Auriemma, playing alongside a roster filled with future professionals, does anyone really think she wouldn't have won multiple championships? Of course she would have. And if Stewart had been in Clark's shoes at Iowa, would she have led them to back-to-back title game appearances? That's far less certain. This is why ESPN's argument falls apart. Clark wasn't just a dominant scorer, she was the reason Iowa became a contender. She took a program that didn't regularly compete for national titles and elevated it to the highest stage in back-to-back seasons. That type of impact is far more impressive than winning a title on a team already stacked with talent. Beyond leading Iowa to unprecedented success, Clark's individual dominance is something we've never seen before. All-time leading scorer in NCAA basketball history, men's or women's. 3-time NCAA scoring leader, 2-time NCAA assist leader, 2-time AP Player of the Year, 2-time Naismith Player of the Year. No player in history has combined elite scoring and elite playmaking at the level Clark has. Her ability to lead the nation in both scoring and assists proves she wasn't just carrying her team by scoring, she was making everyone around her better. And yet, ESPN ignores these accomplishments because of one missing piece: a championship. The true measure of greatness. The ultimate test of greatness isn't just about trophies, it's about legacy. What impact did a player leave on the game? How did they change the way the sport is played, watched, and perceived? Clark didn't just put up numbers, she revolutionized women's basketball. She drew record-breaking TV ratings for women's college basketball. She sold out arenas at every away game, something unheard of before. She drove massive merchandise sales and spiked interest in the sport like never before. She made people care about women's college basketball on a national scale. Before Caitlin Clark, women's college basketball wasn't regularly drawing millions of viewers. She single-handedly changed that. She turned Iowa into must-watch television, brought in a wave of new fans, and helped elevate the entire sport's visibility. None of the players on ESPN's top 5 list had this level of cultural and financial impact on the game. So if championships are the only thing that matters, then why does ESPN conveniently ignore the fact that Clark's influence has reshaped women's basketball more than any other player before her? The reality is ESPN is picking and choosing criteria to fit their own narrative. Clark's dominance, her records, and her cultural impact all point to one undeniable truth. She is one of the greatest college basketball players of all time, championship or not. And the fans know it, even if ESPN refuses to admit it. ESPN's omission of Caitlin Clark from their top 5 greatest women's college basketball players list is not just a snub, it's a deliberate move that exposes a clear double standard in how they evaluate greatness. The argument that Clark doesn't belong in the conversation because she hasn't won a national championship completely ignores the broader impact she has had on the sport. Let's break down why this argument is flawed and why Clark's legacy should be measured by more than just trophies. The idea that winning a national championship is the defining factor in ranking an all-time great player is inconsistent at best. Championships in college basketball are team accomplishments, influenced by factors beyond an individual player's talent: coaching, supporting cast, strength of schedule, and even luck in a single elimination tournament format. If championships were the only thing that mattered, then why are players like Larry Bird, Oscar Robertson, and Pete Maravich universally recognized as some of the greatest in men's college basketball, despite never winning a title? ESPN has never penalized male players for lacking a championship, yet when it comes to Caitlin Clark, suddenly the absence of a national title is a disqualifier. This contradiction reveals the flawed nature of ESPN's argument. Greatness is not solely about team accomplishments, it's about individual dominance, skill, impact on the game, and influence beyond the court. Clark checks all those boxes in ways no other player in recent history has. To fully appreciate Clark's greatness, we have to examine the circumstances under which she played. Unlike other players on ESPN's top 5 list, Clark did not step into an already dominant program. Breanna Stewart played at UConn, a school that has produced more WNBA players than any other and won multiple national championships before she ever stepped on the court. She had the advantage of playing with elite teammates and a Hall of Fame coach in Gino Auriemma. Cheryl Miller played at USC, surrounded by future Hall of Famers in a program that was already competing at the highest level. Maya Moore also played at UConn, benefiting from the same dynasty as Stewart, with a team stacked with All-Americans. Clark, on the other hand, built Iowa into a contender practically on her own. Before Clark arrived, Iowa was a respectable program, but not a powerhouse. Unlike UConn or South Carolina, which reload with 5-star recruits year after year, Iowa lacked a roster full of elite talent. Clark didn't inherit a championship-caliber team. She created one. She carried Iowa to back-to-back national championship games against the odds, elevating the level of play of those around her and proving that individual brilliance can take a team further than a stacked roster alone. If she had been at UConn or South Carolina, does anyone doubt that she would have won multiple championships? And if Breanna Stewart or Cheryl Miller had been at Iowa instead, would they have accomplished what Clark did? That's a much harder argument to make. This is why context matters when evaluating greatness. Even if we set aside the championship debate, Clark's individual statistics alone should have cemented her spot among the greatest college players of all time. A 3-time NCAA scoring leader and 2-time assist leader, proving she wasn't just a scorer, but an elite playmaker. A 2-time AP Player of the Year and 2-time Naismith Player of the Year, showing consistent dominance over multiple seasons. The only player in history to lead the nation in both points and assists multiple times. No other player on ESPN's top 5 list had this level of statistical dominance. And yet, ESPN is conveniently ignoring the numbers because they don't fit their narrative. Clark's greatness extends far beyond the court. She has transformed women's college basketball in a way that no player before her has. She set TV viewership records for women's college basketball, drawing millions of fans to the sport. She sold out arenas across the country, making Iowa the hottest ticket in the game, something unheard of before her arrival. She drove massive merchandise sales, with her jersey becoming one of the top-selling in all of college sports, men's or women's. She played a major role in the explosion of NIL, name, image, and likeness deals in women's sports, proving that female athletes can be just as marketable as their male counterparts. Before Clark, women's college basketball was gaining traction, but it wasn't commanding national headlines on a daily basis. She changed that. None of the players on ESPN's list had this kind of cultural impact on the sport. If greatness is measured not just by numbers but by influence, then Clark is in a league of her own. The real reason ESPN left Clark off the list. ESPN's exclusion of Clark isn't about basketball, it's about protecting their own narratives. For years, ESPN has invested in promoting certain athletes as the faces of women's basketball. They've spent years building up players like Angel Reese, Aja Wilson, and others while downplaying Clark's accomplishments. Recognizing Clark as one of the greatest ever would mean admitting that she has surpassed many of the players they have spent years hyping up. That's why they continue to push double standards. When Angel Reese taunted Clark in the national championship game, ESPN defended her and called it competitive fire. When Clark showed the same competitive intensity, ESPN criticized her. When other players dominate, ESPN celebrates their greatness. When Clark dominates, they find ways to discredit it. It's a calculated effort to diminish her legacy while still using her name and face to drive viewership and engagement. They know Clark is the biggest name in women's basketball, but they refuse to give her the respect she deserves. History will remember Caitlin Clark. ESPN's rankings won't matter. In the end, ESPN can manipulate rankings, shift goalposts, and push whatever narratives they want, but history won't care about their lists. Years from now, when people look back at the impact of Caitlin Clark, they won't be talking about ESPN's rankings. They'll be talking about how she shattered scoring records, how she revolutionized the visibility of women's basketball, how she packed arenas and drew millions of new fans to the sport, how she changed the business of women's sports forever. That's what true greatness looks like, and no ESPN list can change that.